it's time for my next quarterly reading wrap up, and in today's video I'm going to be discussing the books that I read in the months of April, May, and June 2025. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jackie. I'm a mystery author and a mystery reader, and in today's video I'm going to talk about my favorite reads of the last quarter. First, let's talk very quickly about my stats. In the month of April, I read these books right here. May, I read these books. And in June, I read these books right here. Altogether, all of these books add up to 6,642 pages read, which is not that different from what I read in Q1. I think it's a little under 200 pages less, but a pretty comparable total. And when you find an average of all of my ratings from the quarter, it evens out to 3.5 stars. That was my average rating, so perfectly in the middle. I believe I only gave one book a full 5-star, and there was one that I gave a 4.5. Every other book that I read was either a 3 or a 4, so a pretty consistent rating across the board. Now, one thing that I did a little differently this quarter is I actually listened to a couple of books on audiobook, and I've never been a huge audiobook person just because I am a little more visual, and so I enjoy having the words on the page to read, and I also know that I can read a lot faster in my head than I can with an audiobook. However, I have Spotify Premium, and Spotify Premium is now including a certain number of hours of audiobook listening time in with your Spotify Premium account. And there were a couple of books on Spotify as audiobooks that I was interested in reading, and they didn't have them at my library or on Libby. So I thought, since this is included with my subscription, why not listen to these books on audio, since I did think they sounded interesting. The two audiobooks that I listened to were Serial Killer Support Group by Saratoga Schaefer. This one was really quite fun. The main character's sister has been murdered, and the police haven't been able to figure out who killed her. And so our main character, Syra, infiltrates a support group for serial killers to figure out if one of them murdered her sister, which is kind of a crazy premise, but very intriguing. I would describe this as like sort of a popcorn thriller. Like, if you want to read something that's just a fun read, I think this is a good book to choose. And I actually really liked Syra's character arc in this book. It went the exact direction that I was hoping it was gonna go. I think this is a great example of a main character with a negative character arc, and I just really enjoyed the progression of her throughout the story. And the other audiobook that I listened to was Made for You by Jenna Satterthwaite, and this also has a really crazy premise because the main character, I forget what her name is. Is her name Julia? Okay, so Julia is what is known as a synth, and she is basically a robot woman, though she is still capable of feelings, even though she's not a biological human being. And Julia was actually created by this company to appear as a contestant on this television show called The Proposal, which is really a very thinly veiled version of The Bachelor. They even reference having rose ceremonies like they do on The Bachelor. So she was specifically made for The Bachelor, Josh. And then there's another timeline taking place after Josh and Julia are married and have a baby. Because yes, somehow this tech company made a robot that is able to reproduce. And in this timeline, their marriage has already started to deteriorate. So when Josh goes missing, Julia becomes the prime suspect in his murder. So another really just interesting premise, I mean, the pitch of like a mystery that features a robot woman who competed on a spoof of The Bachelor just was so interesting to me. And so even though I'm not a huge audiobook person, these were two books that I really wanted to check out, and I'm glad that I was able to listen to them on Spotify audio. So I kind of already started reviewing the books, sorry about that, but let's talk about a few particular standouts from this quarter for me. I did read 2 NetGalley arcs this quarter, and I have to say I really thoroughly enjoyed both of them. First, Death at a Highland Wedding by Kelly Armstrong. This was my one 5-star read of the quarter, and I just really loved this book. This is part of the A Rip Through Time series, and this is definitely my favorite in the series so far. This series follows a modern-day homicide detective named Mallory Atkinson, who is in Edinburgh, Scotland, visiting her dying grandmother when she finds herself accidentally teleported back through time and into the body of Katrina, who is a housemaid to Dr. Duncan Gray, a Victorian-era medical examiner. And so while she is in Katrina's body, she ends up helping Duncan solve mysteries in the past. Duncan is a really interesting character. He is mixed race and an illegitimate child. So he's really grown up with the stigma of being both mixed race and illegitimate in this time period. And throughout the series, Duncan and Mallory are assisted by Duncan's sister, Isla, who is a widowed chemist, and their best friend, Detective Hugh McCready, who works for the Edinburgh police. I think Hugh and Isla are definitely my favorite characters in the series. I love both of them, and I want them to be a couple so badly. I am definitely a Hugh-Isla shipper. I don't know if they have a ship name. Hyla, I don't know, but whatever it is, I ship it. So I was so excited when I saw the premise of this 4th book in the series, I want to say. I'll correct myself on the screen if I'm wrong. Because the whole premise of this book is that all of the main characters are heading into the Highlands for Hugh's sister's wedding. So we really learn a lot more about Hugh's family and his backstory in this book. Of course, they all go to this wedding, but one of the guests turns up murdered, and so Duncan and Mallory take it upon themselves to investigate and figure out who is responsible. Hugh is one of my favorite characters in this series, so I loved getting a book that gave a lot of great Hugh content. And I also really loved how throughout the book we see Mallory low-key being a Hugh and Isla shipper, a Hyla shipper, if you will. I just thought that was so cute. I've enjoyed all books in this series. When I reviewed the first book when it came out, I did say that I didn't love Mallory as a main character because at the time I felt like she was very judgmental towards the Victorian time period, but I actually really like her a lot more now, and I like where the series has gone with her character because I now feel like she's lost that judgmental attitude that I felt like she had before and really found a place in this society. She's carved out a spot for herself in this world. And I think now she is capable of viewing Victorian society and the people in it with a much more nuanced lens. The thing is, I don't like it when I'm reading historical fiction that I feel like is looking down on the past, right? Because obviously different time periods all have different societal norms, and someday, if humanity is still around, they will look back upon us and think about all the things that we do that are backwards. So I never like looking at people in the past and deeming them all as backwards. I like looking at them and recognizing that they had the same human emotions as you and I. And so I really appreciate how Mallory is now showing a more complex and nuanced understanding of the past and the societal norms. You know, she's recognizing that some experiments and medical procedures that she might deem as barbaric, well, those made it possible for her to have the modern day life with all the advancements that she had and enjoyed. And so I feel like her as a character has really just become someone who I am totally invested in and I can fully root for. This is just my favorite in the series so far. I really loved it. I thoroughly enjoyed myself the entire time that I was reading it. I want to see what's going to happen with the potential romance between Hugh and Isla, but also between Mallory and Duncan. And I would totally recommend this series. Yeah, it's one that I really enjoy, and I think the books actually are getting better as they go on. Sometimes with the series, you feel like the quality starts to go down, but I actually feel like I'm enjoying the series more the longer it goes on. The other arc that I read was The One and Only Vivian Stone by Melissa O'Connor. This is a debut author, and I really enjoyed this book. It is pitched as The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo meets The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and I think that is actually a really great pitch for this book. It totally lives up to that description. The book is told in two timelines. There's one timeline in the 1950s where we're following Vivian, who is a young actress trying to make it in Hollywood. She's always wanted to be a dramatic actress. However, she actually gets an opportunity to sign on with the studio as a comic actress. And she ends up finding out that she has a real talent as a comedian. Her timeline is really the underdog story of Vivian wanting success for so many years and not having a lot of opportunities to finally becoming a rising star in Hollywood. And there is also a bit of a love triangle because there are two men in her life, Hugh Fox, who is a star of action movies and one of her dearest friends who she develops a crush on when she first meets him very early on in her career. And then also Kit Pierce, who she stars in a movie with. And Kit has this perception in Hollywood as being an eligible bachelor, a playboy type, and he develops a romantic interest in Vivian. Then in the modern day timeline, we're following Margot, and Margot has come back to her grandmother's house because her grandmother has recently died. So she's there to clean out the house and put it on the market. While she's doing that, she discovers a box with a bunch of strange tapes. And the voice on the tapes is the very famous actress Vivian Stone. And Margot has no idea why her grandmother would have had these. She has no idea what's on the tapes or why Vivian would have given them to her grandmother of all people. And Margot actually enlists the help of her ex-boyfriend to clean up the tapes and be able to play them so she can figure out the solution to the mystery of why her grandmother had these messages from a famous Hollywood star. I actually realized once I started reading this that I had heard the query letter on the Shit No One Tells You About Writing podcast. That's a podcast where an author and two literary agents critique query letters and first pages from aspiring authors who are trying to get an agent. And once I started reading this book, I realized I remember these first pages. It unlocked a very vivid memory I had of a book that was discussed on the podcast that was pitched as a historical romantic fiction that was inspired by the real-life relationship between Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. So clearly this book made an impression on me because somewhere deep in the recesses of my mind, I remembered when it was discussed on one of my favorite podcasts. And I think if you're interested in that pitch of a woman in the past trying to succeed as a comedian, and also the touch of like the emotional aspect of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, that sense of nostalgia and looking back, then definitely this is a book that I think you should check out. It was a debut, but really well written. This is definitely an author who I want to check out her future books. Vivian in particular, I was very invested in as a character, and I wanted to keep reading to see what was going to happen next on her tapes. I was very invested in her success and admired her scrappy underdog story. Definitely recommend this one if it sounds interesting to you. It is coming out on July 22nd. Thank you so much to the publishers Gallery Books and Minotaur Books for giving me these arcs via NetGalley. I really did enjoy both of these books. They were both so good. And the other book that I think we really need to bring up when talking about my favorites of the quarter is Marble Hall Murders by Anthony Horowitz. This was one of my most anticipated releases of the year. It is the third and final book in the Susan Ryland mystery series, which started with Magpie Murders. I did really enjoy this one. So the basic premise of this series is that Susan Ryland is an editor for a very famous author named Alan Conway. Alan Conway writes a series that's very clearly like a Hercule Poirot sort of mystery featuring this foreign PI named Atticus Pound. And in the very first book in the series, Magpie Murders, Alan is murdered and Susan finds herself investigating what happened to him. In this third book, the publisher has hired a man named Elliot Crace to write a continuation of the Atticus Poon series, since obviously Alan is deceased and he's not going to be writing anymore. They ask Susan to come and edit this book since she was Alan's editor, which she agrees to do. Elliot is, let's say, mischievous, a bit troubled, and he actually is the grandson of a very famous children's writer named Miriam Crace, who is now deceased, but in her time was one of the most famous children's authors in all of Britain, beloved by all. However, Elliot tells Susan, my grandmother was not a nice person. She was a very evil, controlling woman, and we were all living at her estate, Marble Hall, him and his entire extended family, and really just consistently belittled and controlled by Miriam. Who she actually was a stark contrast to her public persona. And Elliot also says, my grandmother did not die a natural death. Somebody at Marble Hall murdered her, and I put a hint to the killer's identity inside this new manuscript. Of course, after he says this, he is promptly killed, and Susan finds herself investigating a murder yet again because, due to a public argument that she had with Elliot before his death, the police now think that she might have been the one to kill him. What I really love about this series is that every book also has a book within a book. So you will have Susan's storyline, and then also you will follow along with Susan as she is reading an Atticus Poon manuscript. And I really love that because the Atticus Poon books just give the vibe of a classic Agatha Christie novel. And you know that I love Agatha Christie and her mysteries. I do think my biggest issue with this book is I felt like it took a very long time for Elliot to actually be murdered, considering it tells you on the dust jacket that he's murdered. I was surprised how long it took in the story for him to actually die, though I was still interested in what was happening because we did have that plot element of who killed Miriam Crace. So that was still keeping my interest, and I was also very interested in the book within a book and finding out who done it in the Atticus Poon story. So I was still invested, but at a certain point I was reading it being like, Elliot is still alive. When is this man gonna die? So that would be my biggest complaint with the book, that it did take a long time to actually get to that promised murder. But I do love this series. I think the reason that I love them is because I can tell that Anthony Horowitz really loves mysteries. He knows the mystery genre. He loves Agatha Christie. He loves classic mysteries like I do. And so I feel that knowledge and that love and that passion just come through in his writing of these books. This is the final Susan Ryland book, and I think the way her character ends up was very satisfying to me. I liked how we left things off with her. I like who she ended up with romantically. That I thought was a good choice. And so I feel like even though I love these books, I feel really good leaving Susan right here. I think this is a perfect end to her story. And I definitely want to check out some of Anthony Horowitz's backlist books now that I'm finished this series. I haven't read any of the Hawthorne and Horowitz books, which is a series following a Scotland Yard detective and a writer who is a fictionalized version of Anthony Horowitz himself. They solve mysteries together. So at some point in the near future, I need to dive into those since I'm a Horowitz fan. There's also going to be a PBS adaptation of Marble Hall Murders, which I'm very excited about because I loved the adaptations of the first two books in the series. I do think if you read just Magpie Murders and didn't continue, you would be totally satisfied. So if you want to check these out but not necessarily commit to a series, I do think if you just read the first book and didn't continue, you would be good. You would be totally satisfied. So I think that's about it for my quarterly reading wrap-up. Those were some of my favorite books of the quarter. Let me know what were your favorite reads of the past few months. Did you read any of the books that I mentioned in this video? I would really like to hear from you. If so, It would mean a lot to me if you could give this video a like, and please drop a white heart emoji in the comment section if you watched this video through to the finish. If you'd like to watch my wrap up from last quarter, the link is right here. Go check it out. Thank you so much for supporting my channel, and subscribe if you'd like to see more from me. I post new videos every single week. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you next time.